In 1998 in Oakville, Ontario, one of Canada's most respected builders of warm, glowing vacuum tube amplifiers did something that felt like a betrayal. They stopped trusting the analog signal and built a computer. Sonic Frontiers had built a global reputation on the purity of two-channel stereo, but suddenly they launched the Anthem AVM line, a massive solid-state digital processor designed not for two speakers, but for five. The traditional Canadian hi-fi dealer lost the simple stereo demo. Listeners discovered that adding more speakers to a basement rec room did not make the sound better. It turned the drywall, the glass, and the furniture into acoustic enemies. The room became a chaotic echo chamber. The paradox was that a company historically obsessed with analog warmth survived only by embracing ruthless digital mathematics. But the real story of Anthem is not just the story of a digital processor. It is the story of how Canadian engineering realized that the hardest component to control in a stereo system was the room itself. Every week, we tell the stories of Canadian speakers, amplifiers, audio labs, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music and film, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in an Oakville facility in the late 1990s. In the early 1990s, the Canadian hi-fi industry was built on a very specific definition of truth. That truth required exactly two speakers, placed carefully in a quiet room, driven by equipment that did as little to the signal as possible. In Oakville, Ontario, a company named Sonic Frontiers had mastered this quiet art. They built vacuum tube amplifiers, electronic devices that use glowing glass tubes to increase a weak audio signal so it can drive speakers, known by enthusiasts for their warm and natural sound. Sonic Frontiers was not a mass-market brand. They sold heavy, expensive, beautifully crafted instruments to audiophiles who spent their weekends adjusting the placement of a stereo pair by fractions of an inch, seeking the perfect acoustic illusion. Two-channel stereo, a system designed to reproduce sound using only a left and a right speaker, was the undisputed king of high-fidelity playback. But by 1996, the definition of the Canadian listening room was fracturing. The catalyst for this chaos was a small silver disc. The DVD, a digital optical disc storage format, brought discrete 5.1 surround sound out of the commercial cinema and directly into the home. Unlike the hazy blended surround sound of the VHS era, the DVD provided 6 independent channels of complex digital audio. It demanded precision. The era of home theater, a multi-speaker system designed to surround the listener with the directional audio of a film soundtrack, was moving out of specialized custom installations and crashing into regular Canadian basements. In Toronto stereo showrooms along Spadina Avenue and in Vancouver music stores, dealers watched their floor traffic change. Buyers no longer walked in asking for the most accurate stereo amplifier to play their vinyl records. They walked in asking how to fit a center channel, 4 surround speakers, a heavy tube television, and a tangle of interconnect cables into a family living room. Sonic Frontiers, observing this from their Oakville facility, recognized a violent shift in the market. The high-end two-channel audio sector was shrinking. If a Canadian electronics manufacturer wanted to survive the coming decade, they had to understand video. They had to understand surround sound. To bridge this gap without alienating their loyal tube amplifier purists, Sonic Frontiers created a subsidiary brand. They called it Anthem. Initially, Anthem was simply meant to be the solid-state, more affordable arm of the company, building robust but traditional analog gear. But the market did not just need cheaper amplifiers. The market was developing a massive, systemic acoustic problem. In a traditional stereo setup, a listener had to manage the acoustic reflections of 2 speakers. It was difficult, but achievable with heavy curtains, a thick rug, and careful furniture placement. Home theater destroyed that delicate geometry. Suddenly, a typical Canadian basement rec room had a center-channel speaker sitting on a hard glass television stand, creating harsh vocal reflections. It had left and right speakers pushed deep into the corners, artificially booming the bass. It had two rear speakers mounted near the ceiling, firing directly at a leather sofa. And it had a subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, pressurizing the entire space, rattling the drywall, the windows, and the heating ducts. When a heavy action sequence played on a DVD, the room did not sound like a professional cinema. It sounded like a localized acoustic war. Frequencies collided in the air, dialogue became muddy and impossible to hear. The low frequencies turned into a booming, indistinct drone that tired the ears. The Canadian absence became obvious. The market did not lack speakers. It lacked a central brain capable of organizing them. To control this chaos, the industry relied on the AV processor, a home theater control unit that decodes digital surround formats, manages multiple channels, and prepares the signal before power amplification. But early 1990s processors were rudimentary. They could steer a sound effect to the correct speaker, but they were entirely blind to the room itself. If a dealer set up an expensive 5-speaker system in an acoustically treated showroom, it might sound brilliant. But when that same system was boxed up, driven to a cottage in Muskoka, and wired into a room with vaulted wooden ceilings and bare hardwood floors, it sounded harsh, scattered, and uncontrolled. The electronics were doing their job. The speakers were doing their job. The physical environment was ruining the result. Anthem's engineers realized that the future of high-end audio was no longer purely analog. It had to be strictly digital. A vacuum tube could make a signal sound warm, but a tube could not delay a rear audio channel by 3 milliseconds to compensate for a speaker placed too close to the couch. A traditional analog crossover could not surgically cut a specific bass frequency that was causing a basement wall to resonate. To fix the room, the equipment had to measure the room. And to embrace measurement, Anthem had to abandon the very philosophy that had made sonic frontiers famous. In 1998, they released the Anthem AVM-1. The Audio-Video Master was a pre-amplifier and processor that looked less like traditional hi-fi and more like an industrial computer. It was a statement of intent. Anthem was no longer just building amplifiers. They were building digital traffic controllers for an increasingly complicated listening era. But the AVM-1, as advanced as it was, still relied on human ears and a basic sound level meter for setup. A listener had to sit in the primary viewing chair, hold a plastic meter, play static noise through each speaker, and manually adjust the volume trims and distance delays in the processor's on-screen menu. It was a crude form of mapping. It balanced the volume, it down to pi and bounds the but it did not correct the acoustic reflections. It did not know that the left speaker was sitting on thick carpet, while the right speaker was sitting on bare tile. It could not see the room. The engineers in Oakville knew that manual calibration was a dead end. The average buyer did not want to be an acoustician. They just wanted to watch a movie without the dialogue getting buried under the bass. To truly control the room, a processor needed to do something that had previously been restricted to high-end acoustic laboratories. It needed to listen to the room, analyze the returning sound waves, and rewrite the audio signal in real time to cancel out the room's physical flaws. It needed automated room correction software. But Sonic Frontiers, despite their brilliance with circuitry, did not have the massive research budget required to develop proprietary digital acoustic mapping from scratch. They were a boutique amplifier company trying to become a software company in a rapidly accelerating digital market. By 1998, the financial pressure of the digital transition was mounting. The high-end tube market was too small to fund the massive research and development needed for the next generation of processors. Anthem had the vision, but they needed a partner with immense resources, manufacturing scale, and most importantly, a deep institutional understanding of how sound behaved in real-world spaces. They needed the resources of a giant. The hardware could decode the movie. The hardware could power the speakers, but the hardware could not fix the drywall. By the late 1990s, the financial strain of developing complex digital processors was threatening to crush sonic frontiers. But their early work on the Anthem AVM line had caught the attention of an audio giant. In 1998, Paradigm, a massively successful Canadian speaker manufacturer, purchased Sonic Frontiers and the Anthem brand, eventually moving its operations from Oakville to Paradigm's colossal manufacturing facility in Mississauga, Ontario. This acquisition was not just a transfer of ownership. It was a collision of two entirely different audio cultures. Sonic Frontiers had been a boutique company built on the art of the vacuum tube. Paradigm, by contrast, was an industrial powerhouse built on cold, hard data. Paradigm's foundational philosophy was rooted in the National Research Council, NRC Loudspeaker Lab in Ottawa. They believed in blind listening tests, strict frequency response targets, and the anechoic chamber, a specialized test room designed to absorb all acoustic reflections so a speaker can be measured without the room interfering. Paradigm trusted measurements over magic. When they absorbed Anthem, they injected that strict NRC measurement culture directly into Anthem's electronics division. The immediate result was the Anthem AVM-20, launched in 2001. It was a behemoth. But more importantly, it was built like a computer with an upgradable architecture. The AVM-20 utilized advanced DSP, digital signal processing, software-based sound shaping inside an audio device, which meant that the processor could manage complex routing, crossover frequencies, and timing delays with mathematical perfection. It allowed a Toronto hi-fi dealer to take 5, 6, or 7 speakers and blend them seamlessly. The AVM-20 was a massive retail success, cementing Anthem's reputation as a serious high-end home theater brand. But the engineers in Mississauga knew that the AVM-20 had only solved half the problem. The DSP could perfectly manage the signal before it left the processor. But the moment the sound left the speaker and hit the drywall of a Canadian basement rec room, the math fell apart. The room was still destroying the sound. In a perfectly treated acoustic laboratory, a speaker measures flat and accurate. In a living room with glass patio doors, a leather sofa, a hardwood floor, and asymmetrical walls, that same speaker creates a chaotic mess of reflections and standing waves. A standing wave occurs when a low-frequency sound bounces between parallel walls, causing the bass to sound artificially boomy in one seat and completely hollow in another. To solve this, Anthem realized they had to take the measurement culture of the NRC anechoic chamber and somehow package it into a consumer product. They had to teach the processor how to see the room. The solution was ARC, Anthem Room Correction. Room correction, software that measures a room and adjusts playback to reduce acoustic problems, was not an entirely new concept in the audio industry. But early competitor systems were often crude. They used cheap plastic microphones, ran a quick sweep of static noise, and made simple equalizer adjustments that often drained the life out of the speakers, leaving them sounding thin and unnatural. Anthem refused to release a simple equalization toy because they were backed by Paradigm, a company that literally designed and manufactured speakers. Anthem understood exactly how a speaker was supposed to behave. Their software was not designed to artificially boost a bad speaker. It was designed to mathematically subtract the room's interference from a good speaker. The physical breakthrough for the consumer was the box itself. When a customer purchased an ARC-enabled Anthem processor, they did not just get a heavy metal chassis, they received a separate, specialized kit. Inside was a heavy-duty, calibrated microphone, A sensitive acoustic measurement device individually matched to a specific software file to ensure absolute accuracy. It came with a proper microphone stand. This inclusion changed the psychological relationship between the listener and the stereo system. Historically, home audio was passive. You bought the gear, plugged it in, and hoped for the best. Anthem turned the listener into an acoustic engineer. To set up an Anthem system, a home theater owner in Calgary would place the calibrated microphone in their primary viewing chair, connect it to a laptop, and initiate the ARC software. The processor would fire a series of sweeping test tones through each speaker in the room. The microphone would capture exactly how those tones behaved as they bounced off the coffee table, the ceiling, and the back wall. The software then compared the messy, real-world acoustic data against the perfect, idealized target curve derived from Canadian laboratory research. It identified the exact frequencies where the room was adding unwanted boom, and the exact frequencies where the room was sucking the energy out of the dialogue. Then, using immense processing power, ARC rewrote the math. It generated a custom digital filter that applied the precise opposite of the room's flaws. If the basement drywall added a 10 decibel spike at 60 Hz, the Anthem processor would automatically reduce 60 Hz by 10 decibels before the sound ever reached the amplifier. When the software was finished and the user pressed play on a movie, the effect was jarring. The muddy, localized drone of the subwoofer vanished. The dialogue in the center channel suddenly locked into sharp focus. The walls of the room seemed to disappear, replaced by the exact acoustic space of the film's soundstage. The microphone had effectively erased the drywall. It was a triumph of Canadian engineering. A company that had once relied on the warm, imprecise glow of vacuum tubes had built the most precise digital measuring tool in the consumer audio market. Anthem had essentially put a Canadian acoustic laboratory inside a box, but that box now had to survive the brutal retail reality of the modern home theater market. By the mid-2000s, the massive Paradigm and Anthem facility in Mississauga, Ontario, was no longer just manufacturing electronics. It was manufacturing a standardized acoustic ecosystem. The Canadian home theater market had reached a fever pitch. The simple 5.1 surround systems that had dominated the late 1990s were evolving into 7.1 configurations, an 8-channel audio layout that added 2 dedicated rear surround speakers to the traditional side surrounds. Suburbs outside Toronto, Calgary, and Montreal were seeing a boom in new housing construction, and in almost every architectural plan, the basement was left unfinished, waiting to be turned into a dedicated windowless theater room. But as the track counts increased on DVD and early Blu-ray discs, the acoustic chaos multiplied. Putting 7 high-output loudspeakers and a massive subwoofer into a low-ceilinged basement rec room was an invitation to acoustic disaster. The sound waves collided, canceled each other out, and created standing waves that made the bass sound like a continuous, muddy drone. For high-end Canadian hi-fi dealers and custom installers, this was a massive retail liability. The problem was not selling the speakers. The problem was keeping them sold. A customer would walk into a meticulously treated Toronto showroom, sit in a perfectly calibrated leather chair, and spend $20,000 on a flagship speaker system. But when the dealer delivered those same speakers to an untreated suburban living room with hardwood floors and vaulted ceilings, the magic vanished. The customer would blame the equipment. Anthem did not just build a processor, they built an insurance policy for the custom installation industry. When a dealer sold an Anthem AVM30 or the legendary Statement D1 processor, they were no longer just dropping off heavy metal boxes. The dealer became a technician. An installer in Vancouver would arrive at a client's home, set up a heavy tripod in the primary listening chair, connect the calibrated ARC microphone, and run the software. The sweep tones would fire. The software would map the acoustic flaws of the specific room, and the Anthem processor would mathematically rewrite the signal to eliminate the room's interference. When the installer pressed play, the muddy bass tightened into violent physical impacts. The scattered dialogue locked dead center to the screen. The heavy drywall of the Canadian basement seemed to sonically disappear, replaced entirely by the acoustic space of the movie. The stakes in the early 2000s listening room had fundamentally changed. If the room correction failed, the entire illusion of the expensive theater collapsed. The stakes were no longer about simply matching an amplifier to a loudspeaker. The stakes were about tricking human biology into believing the physical walls did not exist. And because Anthem was backed by the NRC-style measurement culture of Paradigm, their math was ruthlessly accurate. The brand became a powerhouse. The Anthem Statement D2, released in the mid-2000s, was a brushed aluminum beast weighing nearly 30 pounds, packed with audio DSP and broadcast-quality video processing. It sat in custom Middle Atlantic equipment racks in some of the most expensive homes in North America. It proved that a Canadian company could compete directly with massive Japanese and American electronics conglomerates, winning high-end Processor of the Year awards from major audio magazines. They had successfully taken the anechoic chamber and put it on a microchip. But Anthem had conquered only the elite, custom-built theater room. To achieve true scale and secure their future, they had to take their laboratory software and shrink it into a box that the average home theater enthusiast could actually afford. The problem with the Anthem Statement series was gravity. It was heavy, it ran hot, and it required a separate power amplifier, an amplifier stage that provides the current and voltage needed to move speaker drivers, just to make a sound. It was designed for the 1% of the market that had custom-built, dedicated theater rooms. To achieve true scale, Anthem had to bring their acoustic laboratory into the average Canadian living room. They had to build a receiver. A receiver, an amplifier with source controls, video switching, and digital processing all built into the same unit, was the most fiercely competitive category in consumer audio. For decades, it had been dominated by massive Japanese conglomerates. They competed by adding logos to the front panel, cramming in more inputs, and inflating their wattage numbers. When Anthem launched the MRX series of AV receivers in 2010, they ignored the feature war. Instead, they focused entirely on the room. The MRX 300, 500, and 700 were black, understated, and aggressively functional. But what made them revolutionary was what came in the box. Even with their entry-level receiver, Anthem included the full ARC kit. Buyers did not get a cheap plastic puck to measure their room. They got the heavy-duty calibrated microphone, the serial-numbered software CD, and the proper tripod. This decision changed how mid-tier audio was sold in Canada. In a hi-fi shop in Montreal, or a big-box audio retailer in Vancouver, a salesperson no longer had to convince a buyer that the amplifier had a warmer tone. The pitch became entirely visual and empirical. The dealer would set up a pair of Paradigm speakers in an untreated, echo-heavy demo room. They would run the ARC software on a laptop, showing the customer a graph of exactly how badly the room was destroying the bass. Then, the dealer would hit a button. The software would calculate the correction, upload the new math to the MRX receiver, and play the music again. The physical transformation of the sound was undeniable. The muddy resonance vanished. The stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, snapped into brilliant focus. The bass stopped rattling the display shelves and began punching cleanly through the air. Listeners were no longer buying an amplifier. They were buying a digital cure for their terrible drywall. This created a massive cultural moment in the North American audio enthusiast community. On forums like Canuck Audio Mart, a fierce loyalty developed. The conversation around home theater fundamentally shifted. Audiophiles stopped arguing purely about watts and power supplies and started trading screenshots of their ARC target curves. Anthem had successfully trained a generation of Canadian and American listeners to view their physical room not as a permanent limitation, but as a software problem that could be solved. By the early 2000s, the synergy between Paradigm and Anthem was absolute. The massive factory in Mississauga was pushing out thousands of speakers specifically designed to work in tandem with Anthem electronics. It was a closed loop of Canadian engineering. Paradigm drivers moved the air, and Anthem DSP controlled how that air behaved. They had reached the peak of the dedicated home theater era. The MRX series was universally praised by the global hi-fi press. If a competitor released a new flagship processor, the immediate question from reviewers was no longer how many inputs it had. The question was, how does its room correction compare to Anthem? The Canadian brand had become the benchmark for acoustic truth in a digital age. But a benchmark is only secure as long as the rules of the test remain the same. The Anthem ecosystem relied on people wanting a room full of separate speakers, thick copper cables, and a central piece of heavy hardware. The software was working, but the listening room it was designed to measure was about to change its shape entirely. The first crack in Anthem's living room dominance did not come from a failure of measurement. It came from a failure of patience. By the early 2000s, the Canadian basement rec room was undergoing a profound architectural shift. A decade earlier, buyers had proudly displayed their heavy, brushed aluminum AV receivers and thick copper cables as status symbols. But as flat-panel televisions became thinner, consumers wanted their audio to disappear. The traditional 5.1 or 7.1 home theater, a system requiring separate wooden cabinets, heavy speaker wire, and a massive central processor, was suddenly viewed not as an entertainment hub, but as a domestic burden. The immediate threat was the soundbar, a wide, single-cabinet speaker designed to sit under a television and artificially simulate surround sound without rear speakers or complex wiring. A soundbar could never measure flat in an anechoic chamber. It could not perfectly map the acoustic flaws of a Montreal living room. But it was cheap. It required exactly one cable, and it could be carried out of a Best Buy or Future Shop under one arm. For the mass market, convenience brutally overruled acoustic truth. As soundbars eroded the entry-level audio market, the big-box retail space changed. Canadian electronics chains stopped dedicating massive floor space to receiver walls and passive speaker pairs. The physical shelf space for traditional component audio shrank. An Anthem MRX receiver was a heavy, sophisticated piece of equipment that required a skilled salesperson to demonstrate its room correction software. When the retail environment shifted to grab-and-go convenience, that demonstration became much harder to find. But the soundbar was only a symptom of a much larger, more violent technological shift. The real crisis for Anthem, and for every high-end processor manufacturer, was the video cable. Historically, a Canadian audiophile could buy a Bristol or Class A power amplifier, plug it into a pair of Paradigm speakers, and leave it untouched for 30 years. Amplification was a mature science. But an AV processor, a home theater control unit that manages both digital audio and video routing, was tied to the rapidly accelerating evolution of television screens. The industry had adopted HDMI, high-definition multimedia interface, a single cable standard designed to carry both digital video and high-resolution audio. But HDMI was not a static technology. It was a software and hardware standard that changed relentlessly. HDMI 1.3 gave way to HDMI 1.4 to support early 3D video. Then came HDMI 2.0 to support 4K resolution. Alongside these shifts came new versions of HDCP, high bandwidth digital content protection, a digital handshake required to prevent piracy. If the television, the disc player, and the Anthem processor did not all share the exact same HDCP standard, the screen would simply go black. This created a terrifying new reality in the Canadian hi-fi market: obsolescence pressure. A listener could spend $5,000 on a flagship Anthem statement processor. The DSP, digital signal processing, could be flawless. The ARC microphone could map the room perfectly. The power supplies could be overbuilt. But if that processor was built with HDMI 1.4 and the user bought a new 4K television the following year, the processor could not pass the video signal. A flawless piece of Canadian acoustic engineering became a heavy metal paperweight, not because the sound failed, but because the video standard changed. For the massive Japanese conglomerates dominating the global receiver market, this planned obsolescence was a business model. Brands like Yamaha, Denon, and Onkyo survived by churning out slightly updated, mass-produced receivers every 12 months, treating them like disposable technology. Anthem could not play this game. They were a premium brand designing complex, lab-tested, upgradable architectures. Their manufacturing, partially in Canada, partially utilizing Paradigm's global supply chains, was built for quality, not for annual disposal. They could not afford to redesign an entire motherboard every time the HDMI consortium updated a copy protection code. On Canuck Audio Mart and Vintage Audio forums, earlier generations of Anthem AVM processors began showing up at a fraction of their original price. The audio sections were still spectacular, but they lacked the correct video switching for modern televisions. The badge still meant Canadian engineering. The market economics underneath it had changed. The pressure was crushing. The entry-level market was abandoning receivers for soundbars. The high-end market was demanding a new video board every 18 months. And a new, incredibly complex immersive audio format was looming on the horizon, threatening to make every existing processor on Earth obsolete. Anthem was backed into a corner. To survive, they had to decide whether to fight the Japanese giants in the disposable receiver market or abandon the middle ground entirely. The decision made inside the Mississauga facility was ruthless, but it saved the company. Anthem chose to stop fighting for the casual living room. They let the mass market go. While massive foreign competitors engaged in a brutal race to the bottom, stripping out high-quality power supplies to hit a $500 price point on a future shop shelf, Anthem retreated upward. They repositioned the brand. They realized that the consumers buying soundbars and Bluetooth speakers were never going to place a calibrated microphone on a tripod anyway. The future of Anthem was not in retail volume. It was in absolute acoustic authority. This strategic pivot was perfectly timed for the next massive disruption in home audio. In the mid-2000s, the commercial cinema industry introduced Dolby Atmos, an object-based audio format that maps sound to specific three-dimensional locations in a room rather than relying on traditional fixed channels. Suddenly, a helicopter in a movie soundtrack was not just panned to the left rear speaker, it was mathematically mapped by the software to fly directly overhead. To reproduce this illusion at home, the industry pushed immersive audio, a surround format that adds overhead or height channels for three-dimensional sound. The standard high-end Canadian home theater expanded from a 5.1 layout to 7.1.4. This meant 7 ear-level speakers, 1 active subwoofer, and 4 dedicated speakers mounted directly into the drywall of the ceiling. If 5 speakers had caused an acoustic war in a standard basement rec room, 11 speakers caused absolute devastation. When a custom installer in Calgary tried to balance 4 ceiling speakers firing down onto a reflective leather sofa, while 3 front speakers fired across a glass coffee table, human hearing was no longer enough to tune the room. The phase cancellations were chaotic. The low frequencies collided and smeared. Without intense software intervention, a highly expensive 7.1.4 immersive system sounded like a confused, echo-heavy mess. The room was winning. This was exactly the environment where Anthem's measurement culture became indispensable. As the track counts increased, the value of ARC, Anthem Room Correction, skyrocketed. A standard Japanese receiver might have featured an automated setup program, but Anthem gave the custom installer a visual laboratory interface. Anthem updated their software to ARC Genesis. This allowed Mac and PC users to connect the microphone, look at a laptop screen, and visually see the exact acoustic disaster happening in the room. An installer could adjust the crossover frequencies with surgical precision, dictate exactly how much of the room's natural gain to keep, and upload the heavy correction mathematics directly into the processor's DSP. The hardware reflected this premium shift. The Anthem AVM60 and later the flagship AVM70 and 90 were no longer trying to compete with cheap big-box retail electronics. They were massive, heavy, highly specialized computers disguised as traditional hi-fi equipment. They utilized advanced DACs, digital-to-analog converters that turned digital data into an analog audio signal that rivaled the performance of standalone audiophile stereo gear. Anthem processors became the anchor for the surviving Canadian hi-fi dealers. The stereo shops in Montreal and Toronto that survived the shift to online retail did so by focusing on high-margin, custom installations. They could not survive selling cheap Bluetooth cylinders. They needed to sell a $50,000 dedicated basement theater room, and to guarantee that theater rooms sounded spectacular regardless of the terrible architectural acoustics, they relied entirely on the Anthem processor. The brand was no longer just a digital offshoot of an analog vacuum tube company. It was the powerful digital brain of the Paradigm Group. It was a closed, highly profitable ecosystem. The Canadian engineering philosophy had proven itself correct. If you control the software, you control the room. But this victory came at a profound cultural cost. The entry-level receiver died. The massive walls of AV equipment disappeared from Canadian retail. The middle class of home audio vanished entirely. The market fractured. Two audio worlds emerged. Convenience won the living room. The soundbar took the television. Streaming replaced the disc. Bluetooth replaced the wire. The casual listener moved on. The big box shelves emptied. The cheap processor died. Anthem let it go. They stopped fighting the bottom. They built for the dedicated. They trusted the measurement. The badge survived. The brand remained. It survived by changing. Anthem did not collapse under the weight of the streaming era. Instead, it became something strictly reserved for the rooms that still cared to listen. The global audio industry is littered with the forgotten names of companies that tried to fight the future and lost. But Anthem did not die. When the retail mass market raced toward cheap disposable soundbars, wireless smart speakers, and integrated streaming cylinders, the Canadian company refused to follow the trend downward. They survived by transforming. Anthem abandoned the crowded, unprofitable entry-level receiver market and retreated to the high ground. They repositioned the brand, cementing themselves as the premium digital brain of the Paradigm loudspeaker group. While historic competitors were swallowed by massive foreign conglomerates and reduced to nothing more than a licensed logo slapped on a generic, outsourced circuit board, Anthem remained a closed, highly controlled ecosystem. They proved that as long as people built dedicated, high-end listening spaces, there would always be a market for absolute acoustic authority. In the Canadian enthusiast community today, on platforms like Canuck Audio Mart, Kijiji, and Vintage Audio Forums, the legacy of Anthem's early digital pivot has taken on a strange, split existence. The early Anthem AVM20, AVM30, and statement processors, units whose HDMI video switching boards are now entirely obsolete in the era of 4K streaming and high-bandwidth digital copy protection, have not been thrown into landfills. Instead, they have been rescued and adopted by two-channel audiophiles. A listener in Vancouver or Halifax will buy an older Anthem unit, ignore the outdated video inputs completely, and use it strictly as a dedicated stereo DAC and preamplifier. The video technology may have died with the DVD era, but the Canadian audio engineering inside the heavy metal chassis remains spectacular. The hardware still works. On repair benches across the country, technicians are still replacing capacitors and cleaning volume relays on early Anthem gear, keeping them alive because the robust power supplies and massive internal heat sinks were built for a 30-year lifespan, even if the home theater era they were built for has long since moved on. The original Anthem processors still matter because they fundamentally changed how the audio industry treated the physical listening space. Before Anthem pushed ARC, Anthem Room Correction, into the broader consumer market, the room was viewed as a permanent, unchangeable limitation. If a basement rec room sounded hollow or a living room had too much bass resonance bouncing off the hardwood floors, a listener had to physically fight the space. They had to move heavy furniture, buy expensive acoustic foam panels, experiment with thick rugs, or simply accept the muddy, localized drone of a badly placed subwoofer rattling the heating ducts. Anthem proved that the room did not have to be a physical trap. They proved that a listening space could be mapped, mathematically inverted, and sonically erased by software. By taking the strict, data-driven measurement culture originally developed at the National Research Council Loudspeaker Lab in Ottawa and writing it into digital code, Anthem allowed the average user to experience what a perfectly flat, laboratory-grade acoustic response actually sounded like. They took the privileges of a multi-million-dollar anechoic chamber and packaged them in a retail box with a calibrated microphone and a software disk. Today, the massive manufacturing and research facility in Mississauga, Ontario, still stands as a powerhouse of domestic engineering. It remains a rare anomaly in the modern, heavily outsourced audio landscape. It is one of the few places on Earth where the physical movement of air, the design of speaker cabinets, complex crossovers, woofers, and tweeters happens under the exact same roof as the coding of the digital signal processing meant to control them. The physical hardware that creates the sound and the digital software that tames the room are born in the same Canadian building. The ultimate irony of Anthem's survival is found in its origin. The most ruthlessly precise mathematics-driven digital processor in North American audio history was born from the ashes of sonic frontiers. The very engineers who had dedicated their early careers to the warm, romantic, deliberately imprecise glow of the analog vacuum tube were the ones who recognized that the analog era was ending. The people who had perfected the audio past were the only ones capable of writing the code for the audio future. The home theater boom of the late 1990s and early 2000s taught the global hi-fi industry a painful, expensive lesson. You cannot outspend bad acoustics. A listener can buy the most heavily engineered, perfectly crafted loudspeakers in the world, wire them with the thickest copper cables, and power them with the heaviest amplifiers. But if those speakers are placed in a room surrounded by glass patio doors, hard tile floors, and bare drywall, the physical room will always dictate the final sound. Anthem survived the retail collapse because they understood that the room was not just a container for the stereo system. The room was the final, most distorted component, and the only way to control it was to measure it. Somewhere in a suburban Toronto basement, a heavy, brushed aluminum Anthem statement processor still sits quietly in an equipment rack, its blue digital display glowing faintly in the dark, still holding the exact mathematical measurements of the walls around it, waiting for one more film to move the room. Every week, we tell the stories of Canadian speakers, amplifiers, audio brands, labs, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music and film. Subscribe if that history matters to you. See you in the next one.